The wall of black dust devoured the horizon, like a living beast swallowing mesa tops and scrub brush in its maw. Clara Vayne pressed her weathered palm against the trading post's adobe wall, feeling tremors that spoke of something far worse than wind. The storm moved wrong, too fast, too hungry. In 34 years, she'd never seen the desert rage with such fury. A cry pierced the howling darkness. Not the shriek of wind through canyon stone, but something fragile and human, lost in nature's violence. Clara's scarred fingers found the derringer tucked in her belt as she squinted into the churning wall of sand and debris. The cry came again, fainter now, pulled away by gusting wind that could strip meat from bone. She grabbed her father's old cavalry coat from its peg and plunged into the storm. The desert tried to blind her, sand needling her eyes and coating her throat with grit. Each step forward meant 3 steps back as the wind shoved her toward the post's crumbling walls. But that cry, thin as spider silk and twice as desperate, pulled her deeper into the maelstrom. 50 yards from safety, she found them. An Apache wagon lay shattered against a boulder, its painted symbols barely visible beneath layers of dust and blood. The driver, sprawled motionless, his chest pierced by a jagged wheel, spoke while scattered trade goods painted a tale of desperate flight. Clara's breath caught as she spotted movement beneath the wreckage, a flash of turquoise and deerskin. 2 infants, no more than 5 months old, lay tucked in a traditional cradle board that had somehow survived the wagon's destruction. Their tiny fists waved against the storm's fury, while their cries barely carried above the wind's roar. One wore a necklace of sacred turquoise beads that marked him as Apache nobility, while his sister clutched a carved bone rattle that spoke of careful hands and loving parents. Clara didn't hesitate. She wrapped the babies in her coat and pressed them against her chest, their warmth a stark contrast to the storm's bitter cold. The journey back to the trading post became a nightmare of stinging sand and screaming wind each step, a battle against forces that seemed determined to claim these precious lives. Dawn brought stillness and the sweet scent of rain-washed sage. Clara sat beside her kitchen fire, watching the twins sleep in the makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from trade blankets and pine boards. The boy, she'd named him Takoda, after the Apache word for friend to all, slept with one small fist wrapped around a turquoise bead. His sister Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom, clutched the bone rattle against her chest like a talisman. The trading post squatted like a sun-bleached turtle shell in the vast emptiness between Iron Gulch and the Mescalero Apache reservation. Clara had built her life here, on the knife's edge, between 2 worlds, trading herbs and supplies to Apache families, while dodging the suspicion of white settlers who viewed any kindness toward savages as treason. Her adobe walls bore scorch marks from the last raid by drunken cowboys, and strange scratches near her door suggested someone had been watching measuring planning. She touched the silver locket at her throat, her husband Elias's final gift before that terrible night in St. Louis, when she'd failed to save him from his own reckless pride. The weight of that failure had driven her west, seeking redemption in a land where second chances grew as rare as water in drought season. Mrs. Vayne. Running Horse stepped through her door without ceremony, his weathered Apache features creased with worry. At 60, he'd become her unofficial translator and the closest thing she had to family in this harsh country. "I heard about the storm. Are you—" His words died as he spotted the sleeping twins. "Found them in a wrecked wagon," Clara said, pouring coffee that could strip paint. "Driver didn't make it." Running Horse approached the cradle with reverence, his eyes widening as he took in the turquoise beads and carved symbols. "These are Neshoba's children. The war chief's blood runs in their veins." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Their mother was sacred, a healer blessed by the mountain spirits. If they're here, their parents are dead. Worse, Holt's men have been raiding Apache camps searching for something. If these children escaped, it means their village fell." Running Horse's jaw tightened. You cannot keep them, Clara. The townspeople will demand their blood, and Holt will want them for leverage against Nashoba. Clara studied the sleeping infants, their faces peaceful despite the violence that had orphaned them. Dakota stirred opening dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, while Ayana's tiny fingers reached toward the morning light streaming through the window. The sight stirred something fierce and protective in Clara's chest, the same feeling that had driven her to fight for Elias, even when saving him meant destroying herself. Then I guess we'd better make sure nobody finds them, she said. The thundering of hooves announced trouble, before Clara saw the dust cloud racing toward her post. She'd been crushing willow bark for pain medicine, when Silas Boone and 3 Iron Gulch deputies appeared on the horizon, like harbingers of a particularly vicious storm. The twins lay hidden beneath loose floorboards in her root cellar wrapped in Apache blankets that smelled of sage and sweetgrass. Boone dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator, his silver badge catching sunlight like a warning. At 45, he carried himself with the coiled violence of a man who'd found purpose in other people's pain. His pale eyes swept the trading post's exterior, noting every detail, every possible hiding place. Morning, Clara. He drawled, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. Heard you had some excitement during the storm. Just wind and sand, Clara replied, continuing to grind herbs with steady hands. Nothing that concerns the law. See, that's where you're wrong. Boone stepped closer, his boots stirring dust devils in the yard. Apache wagon got hit by the storm. Driver's dead, but we're missing some cargo. Valuable cargo. Clara's mortar never paused in its rhythm. Sounds like a problem for the territorial marshal, not a trading post keeper. 2 Apache whelps disappeared from that wagon. War Chief's spawn, according to our sources. Boone's smile held all the warmth of January wind. Mayor Holt's offering good money for their return. Seems they'd make fine bargaining chips against their daddy. The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. Holt wanted the children as hostages leverage to force Nashoba into surrendering Apache gold claims or signing away tribal lands. The twins would become pawns in a game that would end with their deaths, whether they proved useful or not. Haven't seen any Apache children, Clara said. Storm hit hard, but I stayed inside. Smart people do that when the desert tries to kill them. Boone signaled his men, who began circling the building like wolves, testing a sheep's defenses. Mind if we take a look around, just to be thorough? I mind plenty. This is my property, and you've got no warrant. Clara set down her mortar and let her hand drift toward the derringer. Unless you're here to buy supplies, I suggest you ride on. Careful, Clara. Harboring stolen property is a hanging offense. Harboring Apache property. Boone let the threat hang in the air like smoke. Well, that kind of treason tends to solve itself in these parts. From beneath the floorboards came the faintest whisper of movement, Ayana stirring in her sleep. Clara coughed loudly to cover the sound while her mind raced through options. Running Horse was miles away, gathering medicine plants in the high country. The nearest help lay in Iron Gulch, where half the population would cheerfully burn her out for defending savage children. You boys seem jumpy, Clara observed. Maybe you should head back to town before you do something foolish. Boone's hand settled on his pistol grip. Maybe you should remember what happened to the last woman who tried standing against Iron Gulch. Clara remembered Sarah Whitmore burned out for selling ammunition to Apache hunters. They'd found her body in the desert, her throat cut, and her trading post reduced to ash. The official report blamed Apache raiders. But everyone knew the truth. Iron Gulch had its own methods for dealing with traitors. I remember Sarah tried to run instead of standing her ground. Clara said quietly, "Big mistake." The standoff stretched like a bowstring until one of Boone's deputies spotted something near the well. Silas Fresh tracks here, small feet, woman-sized, leading toward the post. Clara's pulse hammered as Boone examined the prints. In her haste to rescue the twins, she'd left clear sign of her midnight journey into the storm. The tracks told a story of desperate urgency and careful burden carrying that would be impossible to explain away. "Looks like you found something after all," Boone mused. "Question is, where'd you put it?" Clara's mind raced through possibilities. The root cellar would keep the twins safe for hours, but Boone wasn't stupid enough to leave without a thorough search. She needed time distance, and a miracle, preferably, in that order. "Tell you what," she said, reaching for a leather satchel hanging from a wall peg. "I did find something in the storm, but it's not what you're looking for." She pulled out the dead Apache driver's medicine pouch, its beadwork still beautiful, despite the dried blood staining its edges. Poor bastard was carrying tribal medicine, worth its weight in silver to the right buyer. Boone examined the pouch with greedy interest. Medicine pouches often contained rare herbs, sacred stones, and occasionally gold dust used in Apache ceremonies. "Where's the rest of his belongings?" "Scattered by the wind." This was all I could find before the storm got too bad. Clara shrugged. "Searched for hours, but you know how these things go." The lie came easily because it contained enough truth to feel solid. Boone weighed the pouch in his palm, calculating its value against the effort required to tear apart her trading post. Clara held her breath, while Dakota and Ayanna remained mercifully silent beneath her feet. "Now keep your eyes open, Clara," Boone finally said, pocketing the medicine pouch. "Those Apache whelps are worth more alive than anything you've ever traded. Information leading to their capture gets a $100 reward." "I'll remember that," Clara said. After the deputies rode away, Clara waited a full hour before lifting the floorboards. Dakota and Ayanna had slept through the entire confrontation, their innocent faces peaceful in the root cellar's cool darkness. But Clara knew this was only the beginning. Boone would be back with more men and less patience, while word of the reward would spread through Iron Gulch like wildfire. She had perhaps 2 days before greed overcame caution, and someone came looking for easy money. The attack came at dusk, when shadows turned every bush into a potential threat, and the desert silence pressed against Clara's ears like cotton wool. She'd been feeding Ayanna goat's milk from a makeshift bottle when the first rifle shot shattered her kitchen window, spraying glass across the floor where Dakota had been playing with wooden blocks. Clara scooped up both children and dove behind her heavy oak table as bullets chewed through adobe walls like angry wasps. Outside, men shouted orders while muzzle flashes lit the gathering darkness. At least 6 attackers, possibly more, positioned around her building in a classic siege formation. Clara Vayne. The voice belonged to Luther Vile's Iron Gulch's blacksmith, an unofficial leader of its vigilante faction. "Send out those Apache brats, and we'll let you live." Another volley of shots punched through her walls, sending chunks of adobe raining onto the floor. Clara crawled toward her gun cabinet, keeping the twins pressed against her chest, while Ayanna whimpered softly. Dakota remained silent, his dark eyes wide, but unafraid, as if he understood the danger, but trusted her completely. "Those children are under my protection," Clara called back, reaching for her Winchester rifle. "Anyone wanting them better be ready to pay in blood." "Your choice, woman. But we're not leaving empty-handed." The siege began in earnest. Viles had brought the meanest men in Iron Gulch cowboys drifters and claimed jumpers who viewed Apache lives as worth less than cattle. They took turns shooting at her windows and door, while others crept closer under cover of darkness. Clara counted muzzle flashes and tried to track their positions, but she was badly outnumbered and running low on ammunition. A burning arrow struck her roof, followed by 2 more. Smoke began filtering through her ceiling as flames spread across sun-dried timber. The attackers were trying to burn her out, force her into the open, where superior numbers would end the fight quickly. Clara made a desperate decision. She wrapped the twins in damp blankets to protect them from smoke and crawled toward her back window. If she could reach the old mine shaft behind her post, she might be able to hide the children and fight from better cover. The shaft had been abandoned for years, but its tunnels ran deep enough to keep the twins safe while she dealt with their attackers. The journey across her burning building became a nightmare of heat and smoke. Embers dropped from the ceiling while the twins cried from fear and discomfort. Clara's lungs burned as she dragged them toward safety, her dress smoking from contact with hot debris. She reached the back window just as it exploded inward under rifle fire. Glass fragments cut her cheek while bullets whined past her head. Outside, she could see Viles and two other men closing in their faces painted with shadows and firelight. "Got you now, Apache lover," Viles snarled, raising his rifle. Clara's Winchester spoke first, the bullet taking Viles in the shoulder and spinning him into the dirt. His companions scattered for cover while Clara clutched the twins and prepared for her final stand. She had 3 rounds left and at least 4 attackers still moving. The math didn't favor survival. Then the war cries began. They rose from the desert, like the voices of ancient spirits, high and fierce and full of deadly promise. Apache warriors materialized from behind rocks and bushes where they'd been invisible moments before, their faces painted for battle and their weapons gleaming in the firelight. Running Horse led them, his old cavalry carbine speaking thunder as he charged Viles's scattered men. The fight lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Iron Gulch's vigilantes, brave enough when facing a lone woman and 2 babies, discovered that fighting seasoned Apache warriors required different courage entirely. Those who could still run scattered into the desert, leaving their dead behind, while flames consumed Clara's trading post. The children. Running Horse appeared beside her window, his weathered face creased with concern. "Safe." Clara gasped, smoke making her voice hoarse. "But they'll be back with more men. Then we take them to the sacred caves. Neshoba waits there with his warriors." Running Horse helped her through the window as Apache fighters formed a protective circle around them. "The war chief wants to meet the woman who saved his children." Clara looked back at her burning home, watching years of careful work turn to ash and smoke. But Dakota gurgled softly in her arms, while Ayana's tiny fist gripped her finger with surprising strength. Some things were worth any sacrifice. "Then let's go meet him," she said. The sacred caves lay hidden in a maze of red sandstone cliffs, where ancient peoples had once carved their stories into living rock. Apache families moved through shadowed passages like ghosts, their children playing quietly, while warriors stood guard at every entrance. Clara followed Running Horse deeper into the mountain's heart, carrying Dakota and Ayana through corridors that echoed with whispered prayers and the soft shuffle of moccasined feet. Neshoba waited in the largest chamber, where firelight danced across walls covered in pictographs that told stories older than memory. At 38, the war chief carried himself with the controlled power of a hunting cat. His scarred hands speaking of countless battles, while his dark eyes held depths that Clara couldn't fathom. He wore traditional Apache dress with touches of Spanish silver that marked his status and twin pistols that announced his willingness to fight the white man's war with the white man's weapons. "You have brought my children home," he said in careful English, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. "Running Horse tells me you risked your life for strangers." Clara knelt and placed the twins in a traditional Apache cradleboard that had been prepared for their return. Dakota reached immediately for his father, while Ayana gurgled contentedly, as if she recognized the familiar sense of sage and wood smoke that clung to Neshoba's clothing. "They're not strangers," Clara said simply. "They're children." Neshoba studied her with the intensity of a man, accustomed to reading enemies and allies in split-second glances. "Their mother was killed in Holt's raid. She died protecting our sacred places from men who see only gold where we see the bones of our ancestors." His voice hardened. "You know this man, Holt. I know he wants your children as hostages. He'll trade their lives for your gold claims." Clara accepted a cup of Apache tea from an elderly woman whose kindness transcended language barriers. Running Horse says you're gathering warriors. Enough to make Iron Gulch remember why their grandparents feared Apache names. Neshoba's scarred fingers traced Takota's sleeping face with infinite gentleness. But war will cost more children, more mothers. Maybe there is another way. Clara understood the weight behind his words. Apache bands were already scattered across reservations, their traditional life broken by government policies and gold-hungry settlers. One more war might destroy what remained of Neshoba's people, even if they won every battle. What if we could stop Holt without war? She asked. What if we could expose his crimes to the territorial authorities? White law protects white men. Apache testimony means nothing in their courts. Neshoba's smile held bitter knowledge. But evidence from white witnesses that might carry weight. The conversation was interrupted by a young Apache scout who appeared at the cave entrance, his face flushed from hard riding. He spoke rapidly in his native tongue, while Neshoba's expression grew increasingly grim. What news? Clara asked. Holt has declared martial law in Iron Gulch. Anyone helping Apache hostiles will be shot on sight. Neshoba stood his hand, moving instinctively to his weapons. His men are forming a posse to hunt down my children. They ride at dawn. Clara felt ice forming in her stomach. Holt was escalating beyond simple greed into outright genocide, using the twins as an excuse to launch a war that would end with Apache extermination. Every moment they delayed gave him more time to gather allies and ammunition. How many men, she asked. 50, maybe more. Cowboys, miners, every gun for hire within 100 miles. The scouts' English carried urgency that transcended language. They have new rifles, army weapons. Someone is paying them very well. Neshoba's jaw tightened as he considered options. We could retreat deeper into the mountains, but Holt will follow. He will burn every Apache camp until he finds what he seeks. Or we could give him what he wants, Clara said quietly. The cave fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through stone passages. Every Apache warrior present understood the implication: surrender the children to save the tribe. It was the kind of impossible choice that had driven other Apache leaders to reservation life or death in battle. The children are my blood, Neshoba said finally. Their mother died to keep them from Holt's hands. I will not dishonor her sacrifice. Then we fight, Clara said. But we fight smart. Holt wants to make this about Apache raiders threatening white settlers. What if we turned it around? She outlined her plan while Neshoba listened with growing interest. Instead of waiting for Holt's attack, they would strike first at his weakest point, his reputation. Clara would return to Iron Gulch with evidence of Holt's illegal activities, while Apache warriors positioned themselves to protect the sacred sites he'd been raiding. When Holt moved against them, territorial authorities would see him as the aggressor attacking legitimate Apache holdings. You would walk into a den of enemies alone? Neshoba asked. Holt will kill you the moment you appear. Not if I have something he wants more than my death, Clara replied, glancing at the sleeping twins. Not if I make him think he's won. The plan was dangerous beyond calculation, requiring Clara to place herself entirely at Holt's mercy, while trusting that Neshoba could position his warriors without triggering premature violence. But it offered the only chance to stop the coming massacre without sacrificing the children or starting a war that would destroy both peoples. My children will be safer with you than anyone else, Neshoba said after long consideration. Their mother's spirit speaks well of your courage. Clara accepted the trust with a solemn nod, understanding that she now carried the hopes of an entire people, in addition to 2 innocent lives. What happens if the plan fails? Then we die fighting, and our children remember why Apache blood never bows to gold-hungry thieves. Neshoba touched each twin's forehead in a gesture of blessing. But if it succeeds, maybe our peoples can find peace. The revelation came like a physical blow when Clara found the photograph hidden in Running Horse's saddlebags. She'd been preparing for her return to Iron Gulch when something metallic caught the morning light, a silver frame tucked beneath spare ammunition and Apache jerky. The image inside showed a younger Running Horse standing beside a white family, his arm around a woman whose features Clara recognized with sickening clarity. Eleanor Holt, Mayor Holt's daughter, dead these 10 years from fever. Clara's hands trembled as she studied the photograph, noting the obvious affection between Running Horse and the white woman, the way his calloused fingers rested protectively on her shoulder. A half-Apache child stood between them, perhaps 6 years old, with Running Horse's strong features and Eleanor's gentle eyes. "You know." Running Horse's voice carried no surprise as he emerged from the cave entrance. "I wondered when you would discover my shame. This is why you know so much about Holt's movements, why you're always perfectly positioned to help." Clara's voice sounded hollow in her own ears. "You're working for him. Working for my grandson." Running Horse settled beside her on the canyon rim, his weathered features heavy with old grief. Thomas Holt carries Apache blood, but his grandfather raised him white. He lives in Iron Gulch, believes Apache are savages who killed his mother. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Holt's grandson would inherit the family fortune, including any Apache lands the mayor could steal through legal manipulation. But the boy's mixed heritage made him vulnerable to challenges from other white families who might question his right to pure white property. So you feed Holt information about Apache movements to protect a boy who despises everything you are. Clara felt sick understanding the old warrior's impossible position. "What about Neshoba? What about your own people?" "I tell Holt enough truth to keep Thomas safe, and enough lies to keep Apache families alive." Running Horse's eyes reflected decades of careful deception. But this time is different. Holt knows about the sacred gold mine, knows it holds enough wealth to buy half of New Mexico territory. He will kill anyone to claim it, including his own grandson. Especially his grandson, if the boy ever learns the truth about his heritage. Running Horse took back the photograph with hands that shook slightly. Holt planned Eleanor's death when she threatened to expose his land frauds. He will not hesitate to murder Thomas if Apache blood becomes inconvenient. Clara stared across the desert toward Iron Gulch, her mind reeling from this new complexity. She'd assumed Holt was simply a greedy politician willing to commit genocide for gold. But his motivations ran deeper. He was protecting a family legacy built on lies and murder, while simultaneously planning to destroy the very heritage that might threaten his grandson's inheritance. "Does Thomas know?" she asked. Nothing." Holt told him his mother died of fever while traveling. The boy believes Apache raided their camp up and prevented proper medical care. Running Horse's voice carried infinite sadness. "He hates us for crimes we never committed." "What does this mean for our plan?" "It means Holt has more to lose than we realized. And it means you will not face him alone." Running Horse stood checking his weapons with the methodical care of a man preparing for war. "I know every secret passage in Iron Gulch, every hiding place Holt uses for his stolen goods. More importantly, I know where he keeps the documents that prove his crimes." Clara felt a spark of hope despite the betrayal burning in her chest. If they could expose Holt's fraud while protecting his innocent grandson, they might achieve justice without destroying an entire family. "You're willing to risk Thomas's safety for this?" "I am willing to risk everything to give him the truth about his mother, about himself." Running Horse's scarred hands tightened on his rifle. Eleanor died believing Apache and White could live in peace. Her son deserves to know that dream. From the cave behind them came the soft sounds of Neshoba preparing his warriors for battle. They had perhaps 6 hours before Holt's posse reached the sacred caves, 6 hours to either stop a massacre or die trying. Clara touched the twins' cradleboard, feeling their gentle breathing against her palm. "Then we'd better make sure this works," she said. Iron Gulch, baked under the noon sun like a pot of bones, its single street empty except for horses tied outside the Broken Wheel Saloon. Clara rode into town with Dakota, and Ayanna visible in her arms, their Apache blankets and turquoise beads impossible to miss. Every window seemed to hold watching eyes while dust motes danced in the superheated air. She'd expected immediate confrontation, but the silence felt more ominous than shouts or gunfire. Iron Gulch was holding its breath, waiting for something that would justify the violence everyone knew was coming. Mayor Gideon Holt emerged from his office with the deliberate pace of a man who controlled every element of the scene. At 52, he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd built a fortune from other people's misfortune, his expensive suit and silver-headed cane marking him as the wealthiest man within 200 miles. But his pale eyes held the calculation of a predator measuring prey. "Mrs. Vayne, how thoughtful of you to save us a journey into the desert." Holt's cultured voice carried Boston education and frontier ruthlessness in equal measure. "I trust you've reconsidered your position regarding those Apache children." "I've reconsidered a lot of things," Clara replied, dismounting carefully to keep the twins secure, "including my understanding of their value." Boone appeared from the saloon with 6 armed men, and their faces showing the eager anticipation of wolves scenting wounded deer. But Clara noted something odd in their positioning. They formed a loose circle that trapped her in the street, while keeping clear lines of fire toward the surrounding buildings. Of their value. Holt stepped closer, his cane tapping against hard-packed earth. "Please elaborate." "These aren't just any Apache children. They're Neshoba's twins, blood heirs to the Mescalero's sacred sites." Clara shifted Ayanna to her shoulder, while Dakota gurgled softly. "Worth considerably more than your $100 reward." Holt's eyes sharpened with interest. "You're suggesting a business arrangement." "I'm suggesting we discuss terms. Privately." Clara glanced meaningfully at the gathered crowd of settlers, miners, and drifters who'd been drawn by the promise of violence. Some conversations required discretion. Holt considered for a long moment, weighing Clara's apparent greed against his own suspicious nature. "Very well. Boone, escort Mrs. Vayne to my office. The children as well." The mayor's office occupied the ground floor of Iron Gulch's only 2-story building, its mahogany furniture and Persian carpets incongruous in a frontier town, where most residents lived in tents or adobe hovels. Holt settled behind his desk, while Boone positioned himself near the door, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. "Now then," Holt said, producing a crystal decanter and 2 glasses. "What exactly do you want in exchange for those children?" "Safe passage out of the territory. For me and them." Clara accepted the whiskey despite her trembling hands. "Plus, enough gold to start fresh somewhere that doesn't shoot women for helping children." An interesting proposal, but somewhat short-sighted. Holt sipped his drink while studying the twins with acquisitive interest. "Those children represent leverage against Neshoba's entire band. Their deaths could justify territorial intervention against Apache hostiles. Hardly something to trade for mere transportation costs." Clara felt ice forming in her stomach as Holt revealed his true intentions. He didn't want the twins as hostages, he wanted them as martyrs. Their deaths would provide the excuse he needed to launch a genocidal campaign against Apache holdings with territorial and federal support. "You're planning to kill them anyway," she said. "I'm planning to solve the Apache problem permanently." Holt's smile held all the warmth of winter moonlight. "These children will die heroically defending their people against savage raiders. Newspaper accounts will emphasize their innocent suffering while demanding justice against Apache terrorism. And who decides what the newspapers print? The same people who decide territorial policy, federal funding, and military deployment. Holt stood and moved to a wall map, showing Apache reservations marked in red ink. Politics is simply war by other means, Mrs. Vayne. I prefer to win both. A commotion outside interrupted their conversation, shouting voices, running feet, and the distinctive crack of rifle fire. Holt frowned and moved to his window, while Boone drew his pistol with practiced speed. The Apache raiders. Someone screamed from the street. They're attacking the mine. Holt's face went pale as he realized the implications. The mine contained more than gold. It held documents, ledgers, and correspondence that detailed every illegal activity he'd conducted over the past decade. If Apache warriors captured those records, Boone, take 20 men to the mine immediately. Kill every Apache you find. Holt's cultured facade cracked to reveal the vicious nature beneath. Mrs. Vayne, you'll accompany us. I suspect this attack is more coordinated than it appears. Clara clutched the twins tighter as Boone's men prepared for battle. She'd hoped to expose Holt's crimes through legal channels, but Running Horse had apparently decided on a more direct approach. Now she was trapped between two forces, preparing to tear each other apart, with only her wits and two innocent children standing between civilization and slaughter. You're making a mistake, she warned Holt. Neshoba has every warrior from 3 Apache bands. Your men will be outnumbered 5-1. My men have superior weapons and territorial law on their side. Holt checked a pocket watch with mechanical precision. More importantly, they have excellent motivation. Every Apache death earns a $10 bounty paid in gold. Clara realized with sick horror that Holt had been planning this massacre for months, using Apache raids as an excuse, while secretly arming every desperate man in the territory. The attack on the sacred caves was just the beginning. He intended to exterminate every Apache family within 300 miles. The territorial authorities will investigate. They'll want answers. They'll get answers. Detailed reports about Apache terrorism supported by physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. Holt's smile returned as he contemplated the coming victory. Of course, there won't be any Apache survivors to contradict our version of events. As Boone's men mounted their horses and loaded weapons, Clara made a desperate calculation. She had perhaps 30 minutes before the massacre began, 30 minutes to either stop Holt or die trying. The twins would provide her only leverage as long as Holt needed them for his political theater. She had a chance to derail his plans. If you want these children to die convincingly, you'll need my cooperation, she said quietly. Dead Apache babies don't tell stories about heroic resistance. Holt paused in his preparations, recognizing the truth in her words. What do you suggest? Let me ride to the Apache camp. I'll convince Neshoba to surrender in exchange for his children's safety. Clara held Holt's gaze while her mind raced through possibilities. Then you can stage whatever scene best serves your political needs. Interesting. But what prevents you from warning them about our true intentions? These children. You keep one as insurance, while I take the other as proof of good faith. Clara's heart clenched at the thought of separating Dakota and Ayanna, but it might be their only chance for survival. If I betray you, the child dies. If Neshoba attacks, both children die. Holt considered the proposal while gunfire echoed from the direction of the mines. Very well, but Boone accompanies you, and you have exactly 1 hour to produce results. Clara nodded, committing herself to a plan that would require perfect timing and enormous luck. As she prepared for what might be her final ride, she whispered a prayer to whatever gods watched over lost children and desperate women in the unforgiving vastness of the American West. The sacred mine erupted in chaos as Clara and Boone approached the ancient canyon where her world would either be saved or destroyed. Apache warriors moved through rock formations like spirits of the stone itself, their war cries echoing off canyon walls while rifle smoke drifted between towering pillars of red sandstone. The battle had been raging for 20 minutes, but neither side had gained decisive advantage in the maze of natural fortifications. Clara rode with Ayanna clutched against her chest, while Dakota remained hostage in Iron Gulch, his life depending on her ability to convince his father to surrender. But as they reached the canyon rim, she realized the scope of Holt's deception. This wasn't a simple raid on Apache raiders. It was a massacre designed to erase an entire people from the map. 3 separate forces converged on the sacred site. Holt's hired guns, advancing from the East Territorial Militia, approaching from the north, and federal cavalry, riding hard from the south. Nearly 200 armed men surrounded perhaps 40 Apache warriors, women and children who thought themselves safe in their ancient refuge. Jesus Christ, Boone muttered, surveying the approaching armies. Holt's been planning this for months. You didn't know. Clara studied the deputy's face, noting genuine shock and growing unease. Thought we were chasing raiders, not starting a goddamn war. Boone's hand moved instinctively to his badge, as if remembering his sworn duty to protect innocent lives. There's got to be 30 Apache children down there. The moral complexity hit Clara like a physical blow. Boone wasn't a monster. He was a man doing his job according to laws that classified Apache resistance as terrorism. But those same laws would make him complicit in genocide if he followed Holt's orders without question. Holt's paying $10 per Apache death, Clara said quietly. Including children. Does that sound like law enforcement to you? Boone's jaw tightened as he watched territorial militiamen setting up positions that would turn the sacred caves into a killing ground. What the hell has he gotten us into? Before Clara could respond, Running Horse appeared from behind a boulder with 3 Apache warriors, their faces painted for war and their weapons trained on the approaching riders. The old Apache's eyes reflected decades of accumulated grief and rage, but his voice remained steady. You bring the child to her father, he asked in English. I bring a warning. Holt's not just after your gold, he wants every Apache dead. Clara dismounted carefully, keeping Ayanna visible while scanning for threats. Federal cavalry territorial militia hired killers. 200 men, maybe more. Running Horse translated rapidly for his companions, while the sound of approaching armies grew louder. Nashoba knows. He saw the dust clouds an hour ago. Then why is he still here? Why didn't you run? Because this is where our ancestors sleep. Because some things are worth dying for. Running Horse's weathered features hardened with resolve. And because we have prepared a surprise for Holt's army. Clara followed his gaze toward the mine entrance, where she could see Apache women and children emerging with bundles of what looked like mining equipment. But as they moved closer to the cave mouth, she realized they weren't carrying supplies, they were positioning explosive charges throughout the underground tunnels. You're going to blow the mine, she asked. The sacred gold belongs to our people or to no one. If Holt wants Apache treasure, he can dig it from the bones of his own men. Running Horse checked his rifle with mechanical precision. But first, you must choose your side, Clara Vayne. The time for standing between has ended. The moment of truth arrived with the thunder of galloping horses and the sharp commands of military officers organizing their assault. Clara stood at the fulcrum point between 2 civilizations, preparing to destroy each other, holding an Apache child, whose life represented hope for peace or justification for genocide. Boone drew his pistol, but not to threaten the Apache warriors. Instead, he turned toward the approaching cavalry with an expression of growing determination. Those are federal troops. They'll want to know why a territorial deputy is negotiating with hostile Indians. Tell them the truth, Clara said. Tell them Holt's been stealing Apache land through fraud and murder. Who's going to believe a deputy's word against a territorial mayor backed by mining interests? Boone's laugh held bitter knowledge. I'd need proof, documents, witnesses. Then we'd better get you some, Running Horse said. He led them through a narrow passage that opened into the mine's main chamber, where Clara discovered the true scope of Holt's operation. The cavern held not just Apache gold, but a complete administrative center for territorial land fraud. Filing cabinets, surveyors' maps, legal documents, and correspondence filled makeshift offices carved from living rock. Every illegal transaction, every forged deed, every murdered witness had been carefully documented and preserved. The Holt kept records of everything. Running Horse explained, pulling ledgers from hidden compartments. Insurance against his business partners, proof of their crimes in case he needed leverage. Clara scanned pages of meticulous documentation, while Ayanna slept peacefully in her arms. Murder contracts, bribery receipts, forged territorial seals evidence that would destroy dozens of powerful men if it ever reached honest authorities. But it also revealed something else, a photograph tucked between financial records showing a young man in Apache dress standing beside Eleanor Holt's grave. "Thomas," she whispered. "He knows about his mother, about his heritage." Running Horse took the photograph, with hands that trembled slightly. Eleanor taught him Apache traditions in secret. She wanted him to understand both sides of his blood. Does Holt know? If he did, the boy would already be dead. Running Horse tucked the photograph into his shirt pocket. "Thomas has been working against his grandfather for months, feeding us information about Holt's plans." The revelation hit Clara like lightning. Thomas Holt, the mixed-blood grandson everyone thought was ignorant of his Apache heritage, had been the source of their intelligence about territorial movements. He'd been risking his life to protect the people his grandfather wanted to exterminate. "Where is he now?" she asked. "With the federal cavalry trying to convince them this is a criminal matter, not a military action." Running Horse gathered the most damaging documents into a leather satchel. "But if we cannot stop this battle..." The sentence was finished by an explosion that shook the entire mountain. Dust rained from the ceiling, while the mine entrance collapsed in a roar of falling stone. Outside, men screamed orders, while gunfire erupted across the canyon in earnest. "The charges went off too early," Boone said, checking his pocket watch. "Someone triggered them from outside." Clara felt panic rising as she realized their situation. They were trapped in a collapsing mine, with evidence that could save both peoples, while armies fought to the death in the canyon above. Ayanna stirred in her arms, her dark eyes reflecting firelight from the entrance where flames now danced among fallen rocks. "Is there another way out?" she asked. "Yes, but it leads directly into the federal camp." Running Horse shouldered his rifle while studying alternative routes. "We would have to surrender and hope Thomas can convince them to listen. Or we could fight our way out and try to reach Neshoba," Boone said. "With a baby through 200 soldiers." Clara shook her head. "That's suicide." Another explosion, closer this time, sent more debris raining into the chamber. The mountain itself seemed to be dying around them, ancient stone cracking under pressures it was never meant to bear. Clara looked at Ayanna's peaceful face and made a decision that would determine all their fates. "We surrender, but we do it publicly in front of witnesses who can verify what we found here." She clutched the documentary evidence against her chest. "If Thomas is half the man his mother raised him to be, he'll make sure justice is done." Running Horse nodded slowly, understanding the tremendous risk they were taking. "And if he cannot, then we die knowing we tried to save both our peoples from their own hatred." Clara kissed Ayanna's forehead gently. "Sometimes that's the best anyone can do." The federal camp buzzed with controlled chaos as Clara emerged from the mine's hidden exit with Ayanna in her arms and a leather satchel containing enough evidence to topple territorial governments. Cavalry troopers and territorial officials argued over jurisdiction while the battle raged just beyond the canyon rim, neither side able to claim moral authority in a conflict that had already cost too many lives. Colonel Marcus Webb, a career officer, whose gray hair spoke of 3 decades fighting Indian wars, studied the unlikely group with professional skepticism. Clara Running Horse and Deputy Boone made strange allies, but the documents they carried demanded serious attention. These ledgers indicate systematic fraud involving territorial land grants, mining claims, and federal surveying contracts. Webb said scanning pages of Holt's careful records. If authentic, they constitute evidence of federal crimes punishable by hanging. They're authentic, Thomas Holt said quietly from beside the colonel's field desk. At 21, Eleanor's son carried his Apache heritage in his bones, despite years of white education, his dark eyes reflecting generations of persecution and survival. I helped my grandfather keep them organized. The young man's admission sent shockwaves through the gathered officers. Thomas had been working within Holt's organization for months, documenting crimes while secretly protecting Apache families from his grandfather's increasingly violent policies. Why come forward now? Webb asked. Because genocide is where I draw the line. Thomas indicated the battle raging beyond the canyon walls. My grandfather intends to kill every Apache in New Mexico territory. Men, women, children, anyone who might challenge his land claims or remember the truth about his crimes. Webb's weathered features hardened as he absorbed the implications. Federal cavalry had been deployed to restore order between warring factions, but they'd actually been manipulated into supporting an extermination campaign disguised as law enforcement. Colonel, a young lieutenant called from the communications tent. Urgent telegraph from territorial headquarters. Governor Morrison is ordering immediate cessation of hostilities pending federal investigation. Too late for some orders. Webb muttered, studying reports from the battlefield. Holt's men are already engaging Apache positions, casualties mounting on both sides. Clara clutched Ayanna tighter as gunfire echoed through the canyon, each shot representing another step toward the abyss that would swallow both peoples. Dakota is still in Iron Gulch. Holt has him. We'll get him back. Thomas promised, his jaw set with determination that reminded Clara powerfully of Neshoba. But first, we need to stop this battle before it becomes a massacre. Webb considered options while his communication officers worked frantically to contact field commanders. Federal authority supersedes territorial commands, but convincing individual soldiers to stand down during active combat requires more than telegraph messages. What about a truce flag? Clara suggested. If you could get word to Neshoba, Apache don't recognize white truce protocols, especially when they're being slaughtered. Running Horse spoke with a voice of bitter experience. Too many broken promises, too many lies told under flags of peace. A series of explosions shook the canyon as more mining charges detonated, sending avalanches of rock cascading into the sacred caves where Apache families had sheltered for generations. Clara realized with sick horror that Neshoba was systematically destroying everything rather than let it fall into white hands, including himself and his people. He's going to bring the whole mountain down, she said. Neshoba would rather die than surrender his children's heritage to thieves. An ignoble but pointless, Webb observed grimly. Dead martyrs don't raise children or preserve cultures, unless their sacrifice creates something better. Thomas studied the documents scattered across the field desk, his mind working through possibilities that none of the career soldiers had considered. Colonel, these records prove my grandfather has been stealing federal land through forged surveys and fake territorial grants. What happens to illegally obtained property when the criminals are prosecuted? It reverts to federal control, then gets redistributed according to original legal claims. Webb's eyes sharpened as he grasped the implication. Are you suggesting that Apache land stolen through fraud should be returned to Apache control? That tribal sovereignty could be restored through legal channels rather than military conquest? Thomas picked up a survey map showing the extent of Holt's operations. This represents nearly 1 million acres of traditional Apache territory. Clara felt hope stirring for the first time since the battle began. If they could demonstrate federal commitment to justice rather than extermination, Neshoba might be willing to negotiate. But it would require extraordinary courage from everyone involved, Apache and white alike, to step back from the abyss of mutual destruction. "I'll carry the message to Neshoba," she said. "He'll listen to me because of the children." "Too dangerous. Apache warriors are fighting for their lives. They'll shoot anything that moves." Webb shook his head firmly. "And Holt's men have orders to kill you on sight." "Then we go together," Thomas said. Apache blood and white blood carrying proof that justice is possible. Running Horse studied his grandson with pride and terror warring in his ancient eyes. "If Holt sees you with us, he will know everything. Your life in the white world will be finished. My life in the white world was built on lies and stolen blood." Thomas touched the photograph of his mother's grave, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Maybe it's time to build something honest." Colonel Webb looked at the unlikely trio: white widow, old Apache warrior, and mixed-blood young man who proposed to walk into a battlefield carrying nothing but documentary evidence and desperate hope. By all military logic, the mission was suicidal. But 30 years of frontier warfare had taught him that desperate times called for impossible chances. "God help us all," he said, reaching for his field glasses. "Let's go stop a war." The journey into the heart of the battle became a nightmare passage through collapsing reality. Clara carried Ayanna while following Thomas and Running Horse through smoke-filled canyons where gunfire echoed like thunder and dying men called for their mothers in 3 different languages. Apache warriors fell back toward their sacred caves, while Holt's mercenaries pressed forward with the relentless advance of men paid by the scalp. They found Neshoba making his final stand at the entrance to the deepest cave, where Apache women and children huddled around sacred artifacts that spoke of 10,000 years of continuous habitation. The war chief's face bore fresh wounds, while his ammunition ran dangerously low, but his dark eyes still blazed with unbroken defiance. "You bring my daughter to die with her people?" he asked Clara in English rough, with exhaustion and pain. "I bring proof that not all white men are thieves," Clara replied, offering him the leather satchel containing Holt's records. "And hope that not all Apache men preferred death to justice." Neshoba examined the documents, while bullets whined overhead and explosions shook the mountain. His scarred fingers traced surveyor's marks that proved Apache land had been systematically stolen through forged federal grants, while his eyes absorbed evidence of murders, bribes, and frauds that stretched back 20 years. "This changes nothing. White law does not protect Apache people." He handed back the papers with weary resignation. Better to die free than live as slaves on reservations. What if there was a third choice? Thomas stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal features that combined Eleanor's gentleness with Running Horse's strength. What if Apache land could be returned through white law administered by Apache wisdom? Neshoba studied the young man with growing recognition. "You are Eleanor's son, Holt's blood." "I am my mother's son, Apache blood." Thomas knelt respectfully before the war chief. "She taught me that revenge destroys the avenger, but justice heals both victim and oppressor." A massive explosion sent avalanches of stone cascading past the cave entrance as Holt's men detonated charges designed to collapse the entire mountain. Clara realized with sick horror that the mayor had decided to bury all evidence of his crimes beneath tons of rock, along with everyone who might testify against him. "The mountain is falling," Running Horse shouted over the rumbling thunder of geological collapse. "We must reach the federal camp before the passes close." Neshoba gathered his remaining warriors, while Apache families emerged from the deepest caves carrying sacred objects that represented millennia of cultural continuity. But as they prepared to evacuate their ancestral refuge, armed figures appeared at multiple cave entrances, Holt's mercenaries closing the trap that would bury Apache resistance forever. "Surrender the children and documents." Silas Boone's voice echoed through the cavern, but Clara noticed something different in his tone. The deputy sounded reluctant, conflicted, as if following orders that violated his fundamental beliefs about justice. Mayor Holt offers safe passage for all civilians. The Holt's word is worth less than snake oil. Neshoba replied, raising his rifle despite impossible odds. We die fighting. Wait. Clara stepped into the line of fire, holding Ayanna where both sides could see her. Boone, you've seen the evidence. You know what Holt really is. The deputy emerged from cover with his hands visible but his weapon ready. I've seen enough to know this isn't law enforcement anymore. It's murder. Then help us stop it. Clara offered him the documentary evidence, while Ayanna gurgled softly in her arms. These records prove federal crimes. Real law can still triumph over frontier justice. Boone hesitated, torn between duty to his badge and loyalty to his conscience. Behind him, Holt's mercenaries waited for orders, while the mountain continued its slow-motion collapse around them. Federal cavalry's already moving. Colonel Webb's arrested 3 territorial officials for fraud. What about Holt? Thomas asked. Gone. Disappeared when he learned about the federal investigation. Boone's voice carried bitter disappointment. Probably halfway to Mexico by now, with enough stolen gold to buy his own country. Clara felt despair crushing her as she realized Holt had escaped justice while leaving others to face the consequences of his crimes. But then Ayanna reached out with tiny fingers to touch Thomas's face, and something shifted in the young man's expression. He didn't run to Mexico, Thomas said quietly. He went to Iron Gulch to collect Dakota. The boy represents his only remaining leverage. Leverage for what the game's over. Running Horse checked his rifle while scanning for alternative escape routes. Federal law will hunt him wherever he goes. Not if he can frame someone else for his crimes. Not if he can present himself as the victim of Apache terrorism. Thomas's face went pale as he worked through his grandfather's likely strategy. Dakota's death blamed on Apache raiders would justify everything Holt has done. The federal investigation would focus on Apache crimes instead of white corruption. The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. Holt hadn't run, he'd retreated to prepare his final gambit. Dakota's murder would provide the propaganda victory that would transform Holt from criminal to hero, while simultaneously eliminating the last witness to his crimes. How long do we have? She asked. He'll want maximum political impact. Probably wait until the federal investigation reaches Iron Gulch, then stage Dakota's death as an Apache raid on innocent civilians. Thomas calculated desperately. Maybe 2 hours, 3 at most. Neshoba's jaw tightened as he contemplated the threat to his son. Then we go to Iron Gulch, all of us together. That's what he wants, Apache warriors attacking a white settlement. It would justify everything. Clara bounced Ayanna gently while her mind raced through alternatives. But what if only one person went, someone he wouldn't expect? Too dangerous. Holt will kill anyone who threatens his plan. Boone shook his head firmly. And he's got the entire town convinced that Apache raiders are coming. They'll shoot strangers on sight. Not strangers. Family. Thomas straightened his shoulders with visible resolve. I'm still his grandson. Still the heir to his fortune and political influence. He can't afford to kill me publicly. Clara realized with growing admiration that Thomas was proposing to walk into the lion's den with nothing but his blood relationship as protection. If Holt suspected his grandson's true loyalties, the young man would die horribly. But if the deception held, he might be able to save Dakota and expose his grandfather's final crime. What about afterward? If you succeed, Holt will know you betrayed him. Running Horse's voice carried paternal concern for the grandson he'd never been allowed to acknowledge. Your life among white people will be finished. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Thomas touched Ayanna's tiny hand with infinite gentleness. Maybe it's time to find out what life among Apache people might offer. As another explosion shook the dying mountain, Clara made a decision that would determine whether hope or hatred would triumph in the harsh desert, where two peoples had learned to see each other as enemies. She placed Ayanna in Neshoba's strong arms and checked her derringer with hands that no longer trembled. "Thomas goes to Iron Gulch," she said, but not alone. Iron Gulch shimmered in the afternoon heat, like a mirage of false prosperity, its single street deserted, except for armed men positioned behind barricades and shuttered windows. Clara and Thomas approached on horseback, with careful deliberation, their movements designed to appear non-threatening, while concealing the weapons and evidence that might save Dakota's life. The town had transformed into an armed camp during their absence. Rifle barrels protruded from every possible hiding place, while nervous settlers clutched weapons and watched the desert for signs of Apache attack. Holt had clearly convinced his people that their survival depended on absolute obedience to his orders. "There," a voice called from the Broken Wheel Saloon. "It's the mayor's grandson and that Apache-loving woman." Gideon Holt emerged from his office with the measured pace of a man completely in control of his environment. He wore a black suit that emphasized his pale features, while twin pistols hung openly at his side. But Clara noticed something different in his demeanor, a desperate edge that suggested his carefully laid plans were unraveling faster than anticipated. "Thomas, my boy, thank God you're safe." Holt's cultured voice carried paternal relief with undertones of something darker. "When I heard about the Apache attack on the federal camp—" "No attack, grandfather. The federal investigation exposed your business partners." Thomas dismounted with calculated calm while Clara remained mounted to keep escape options open. "They're singing like choir boys to save their own necks." Holt's pale eyes flickered with dangerous intelligence as he processed this information. "Unfortunate for them, but hardly relevant to our current situation." "Where's Dakota?" Clara demanded, her hand drifting toward her concealed derringer. "Where's the child?" "Safe. For now." Holt's smile held all the warmth of winter starlight. "His continued safety depends on your cooperation with my final arrangement." Clara felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized they'd walked into a trap more sophisticated than simple ambush. Holt had anticipated their arrival and prepared accordingly, using Dakota as bait to draw them into a situation where he held all the advantages. "What arrangement?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from his grandfather. "Apache raiders attack Iron Gulch to rescue their stolen children. Heroic defenders resist bravely, but the savages murder innocent civilians, including women and children, before federal cavalry arrives to restore order." Holt's explanation carried the practiced cadence of a man who'd rehearsed his lies until they felt like truth. Tragic but predictable outcome of Apache terrorism. "Except there are no Apache raiders," Clara pointed out. "Neshoba's people are helping federal investigators document your crimes." "A minor detail. Apache raiders will appear when I require them." Holt gestured toward the surrounding buildings, where Clara could now see armed men wearing crude Apache disguises. Dead Indians tell no tales about mistaken identity. The scope of Holt's deception left Clara breathless. He'd hired men to impersonate Apache warriors planning to massacre his own townspeople, while blaming their deaths on Indian terrorism. The federal investigation would focus on Apache crimes, while Holt emerged as the tragic survivor of savage violence. "You're planning to murder your own people." Thomas said, his voice thick with horrified understanding. "Women and children who trust you. I'm planning to preserve civilization against savage barbarism. Some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." Holt's eyes reflected the cold calculation of a man who'd convinced himself that mass murder served noble purposes. "Your Apache-loving friends have forced this outcome." Clara realized that Holt had crossed a line beyond simple greed or even racism into genuine madness. The mayor truly believed that genocide served righteous ends, that murdering innocents would somehow cleanse the territory of corruption he'd created. Reasoning with such twisted logic would be impossible. "Well, where does this end?" she asked. "After you've killed everyone who threatens your secrets. It ends with Thomas inheriting a clean legacy, a fortune built on honest enterprise, not questionable decisions made by desperate circumstances." Holt's voice carried paternal affection that made his words even more chilling. Sometimes elders must make difficult choices to protect future generations. Thomas stepped forward with visible resolve, his young face hardening with determination that reminded Clara powerfully of both his parents. "I don't want a legacy built on murder, grandfather. I want the truth. The truth is a luxury young men can't afford in territories where survival requires strength." Holt's hand moved to his pistol grip with practiced ease. "But you'll understand when you're older, when you have children of your own to protect." A commotion from the far end of town interrupted their confrontation, shouts, running feet, and the thunder of approaching horses. Clara turned to see real Apache warriors riding hard toward Iron Gulch, their war paint and weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. But these weren't raiders seeking violence. They were Neshoba's people carrying white flags and federal documents that would expose Holt's crimes. Perfect timing, Holt murmured, drawing both pistols with fluid precision. Apache raiders arriving just as witnesses gathered to see their savagery. Clara realized with sick horror that Holt intended to start his massacre immediately, using the Apache peace delegation as unwitting participants in his theatrical production. She drew her derringer while calculating distances and angles, knowing that her single shot would have to count if she hoped to save Dakota and prevent genocide. "Last chance, Thomas," Holt said quietly. "Stand with family or die with strangers." Thomas looked at Clara, at the approaching Apache riders, at the townspeople who trusted him to make decisions that would determine their fate. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction, despite the tears running down his face. "Family doesn't murder children, grandfather. And these people aren't strangers, they're the other half of my blood." Holt's face contorted with rage and betrayal as he realized his grandson's true loyalties. "Then you can die with your Apache friends." The mayor's pistols swung toward Thomas with deadly intent, but Clara was already moving. Her derringer barked once the small bullet taking Holt in the shoulder and spinning him sideways. The mayor's shots went wild as he staggered, one bullet shattering a window while the other kicked up dust near Clara's horse. Iron Gulch erupted in chaos as genuine Apache warriors met fake ones in the dusty street, while confused townspeople tried to distinguish friend from enemy. Federal cavalry appeared on the horizon, racing to restore order before Holt's insane scheme could claim more lives. Clara spurred her horse toward the building where she'd glimpsed a small figure in the upstairs window. Dakota alone and terrified while the world exploded around him. But as she reached the building's entrance, Holt appeared from behind cover, with blood streaming down his arm and madness burning in his pale eyes. "If I can't have victory, I'll have revenge," he snarled, raising his remaining pistol toward the window where his helpless prisoner waited. Clara threw herself from her horse just as Holt fired her body, shielding the doorway, while his bullet carved a furrow across her ribs. She hit the ground hard but rolled toward to cover her derringer empty, but her determination unbroken. Then Thomas was there, tackling his grandfather with desperate strength, while tears streamed down both their faces. The two men struggled for control of Holt's weapon, while Clara crawled toward the stairs leading to Dakota's prison. "Why?" Holt gasped as his grandson's youth began to prevail. "I built this empire for you. You built it on graves, grandfather. It's time to let the dead rest." Thomas wrestled the pistol away with visible reluctance, his Apache heritage finally triumphing over white education. "Maybe we can build something better from the ruins." Clara found Dakota in a locked room, his dark eyes wide with fear, but his spirit unbroken. She gathered the child in her arms while gunfire faded to silence, in the street below, her heart overflowing with relief that both twins would survive this nightmare. Through the window, she could see federal cavalry restoring order while Apache warriors and white settlers began the delicate process of distinguishing between victims and villains. It would take time, perhaps generations, to heal the wounds that greed and hatred had carved into both peoples. But for the first time since arriving in this harsh land, Clara believed that healing might be possible. 3 months later, Clara stood on the porch of her rebuilt trading post, watching Dakota and Ayanna play in the afternoon shade, while their fathers, biological and adoptive, discussed the complex business of building peace between former enemies. Federal investigators had unraveled decades of territorial corruption, returning millions of acres to rightful Apache ownership, while prosecuting white officials who'd profited from systematic theft. Gideon Holt had died in federal custody, his heart giving out during interrogation about murders that stretched back 20 years. Some called it divine justice. Others blamed the stress of facing consequences for crimes he'd committed with impunity. Clara preferred to think he'd simply run out of lies strong enough to support the weight of his guilt. Thomas had inherited his grandfather's legitimate holdings, which turned out to be considerably less than expected once stolen properties were returned to their original owners. But he'd also inherited something more valuable, the chance to bridge two cultures that had been taught to hate each other. He spent his days translating between federal officials and Apache leaders, building the legal framework for genuine coexistence. The territorial governor wants to establish a permanent Indian agency here, he told Clara during one of his regular visits. Federal recognition of Apache sovereignty with you as the official intermediary. Clara looked up from the medicinal herbs she'd been sorting. I'm not qualified for federal appointments. You're qualified by trust. Apache families bring their sick children to you for healing. White settlers respect your judgment about trade disputes. Thomas watched Dakota attempt to teach Ayanna how to stack wooden blocks, his expression soft with affection for the children who'd given his life purpose. Both peoples believe you'll treat them fairly. Clara considered the possibility, while autumn wind carried the scent of pinyon pine and sage across the desert. Her trading post had become an unofficial embassy where Apache needs met white law, where ancient wisdom encountered modern solutions. Perhaps formal recognition would help protect the fragile peace they'd built. What about Neshoba? Does he approve? He suggested it. Says his children need a mother who understands both worlds. Thomas's smile carried knowledge of deeper currents flowing beneath surface politics. Running Horse agrees, though he insists on calling you granddaughter who counts coup on stupid white men. Clara laughed, remembering her first encounter with the old warrior's dry humor. I suppose there are worse titles to inherit. Neshoba appeared from the direction of the Apache camp, his traditional dress supplemented by the silver badge of a federal marshal, another innovation designed to give indigenous law enforcement equal standing with territorial authorities. He moved with quiet dignity, his presence radiating the controlled power that had made him legendary among both enemies and allies. The children grow strong, he observed, settling onto the porch steps beside Clara. Dakota learns English words. Ayanna speaks her first Apache prayers. They're learning to be citizens of both worlds. Clara replied, watching the twins discover that wooden blocks could be stacked into towers that reached toward the infinite sky. Maybe that's the best gift we can give them. Better than the gifts we received as children. Better than hatred passed from father to son like cursed inheritance. Neshoba's scarred hands moved restlessly still, adjusting to a world where problems could be solved through negotiation rather than violence. Thomas brings word that more Apache families want to return from reservations. There's room. Plenty of room for people willing to work together. Clara indicated the vast expanse of desert and mountain that stretched toward horizons unmarked by boundaries of race or nation. The land doesn't care what color hands tend it, as long as those hands are respectful. A dust cloud on the eastern horizon announced the arrival of the weekly supply wagon from Silver City, driven by Deputy Boone, who'd requested transfer to this peaceful corner of the territory. He'd spent months testifying at federal trials, his inside knowledge of territorial corruption proving crucial to prosecuting Holt's surviving accomplices. Now he served as the primary liaison between federal authorities and local peacekeeping efforts. New mail delivery. Boone called, climbing down from his driver's seat with a leather satchel full of official correspondence. Plus, some packages for the little ones. Clara accepted letters from the territorial governor, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and several missionary societies interested in establishing schools that would teach both Apache and English curricula. But the children were more interested in Boone's packages carved wooden animals from a Pueblo artisan in Santa Fe, and picture books that told traditional stories in parallel English and Apache text. Educational materials. Boone explained, watching Dakota examine a carved horse with obvious delight. Federal policy says Apache children should receive the same schooling opportunities as white children, but taught in ways that respect their cultural heritage. Progress, Neshoba said simply. Not the progress my father expected, but better than the wars he feared. As evening approached and painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Clara gathered the twins for their bedtime routine. Dakota had learned to say mama in both languages, while Ayanna showed remarkable aptitude for the traditional Apache lullabies that Running Horse sang during his visits. They were growing into the bridge between worlds that their birth had made possible. Do you think they'll remember? Clara asked Neshoba as they tucked the children into their shared cradle. When they're grown, will they remember how hard we fought to give them this peace? They will remember what matters, that people of different colors can choose love over hatred, that children are more precious than gold, that courage means protecting the weak rather than destroying the different. Neshoba touched each child's forehead in blessing. The rest is just history. Clara stood on her porch after the others had departed, watching stars emerge in the vast desert sky while coyotes began their evening songs. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, its harsh beauty unmarked by the human boundaries that had caused so much suffering. But tonight, for the first time since fleeing St. Louis, with her husband's blood on her hands, she felt truly at home. The twins slept peacefully in their cradle, their breathing synchronized with the eternal rhythm of wind through sage and stone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, federal bureaucrats to educate territorial politicians, to outwit Apache traditionalists, to convince that change didn't mean surrender. But tonight was perfect in its simple harmony. Clara touched the silver locket at her throat, no longer a token of guilt, but a reminder that love could survive even the greatest failures. Elias would have understood her choice to build something beautiful from the ruins of hatred. He'd always believed that healing required more courage than fighting, that building took greater strength than destroying. A soft cry from inside made her smile as she recognized Ayanna's voice calling for attention. Clara hurried to comfort the child, her heart overflowing with gratitude for the storm that had brought these precious lives into her care. Some gifts came disguised as disasters, some blessings arrived wrapped in tragedy. As she lifted Ayanna into her arms and felt tiny fingers grip her thumb with absolute trust, Clara understood that she'd finally found what she'd been seeking in the desert's vastness. Not redemption for past failures, but purpose for future hopes. The twins would grow up believing that people of different colors could love each other as family, that children mattered more than adult grudges, that peace was always possible for those brave enough to choose it. Under the infinite stars of the American West, a white woman rocked two Apache children to sleep, while their father stood guard against threats that grew smaller each day. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected from the beginning of their story, but it was the ending that mattered most, hope triumphing over hatred, love conquering fear, and children sleeping safely in a world their parents had made better than the one they'd inherited. In years to come, when Dakota and Ayanna told their own children about the strange family that raised them, and they would speak of courage, measured not in lives taken, but in lives saved of strength, demonstrated through protection rather than domination, of wisdom that recognized no enemy more dangerous than the hatred that lived in human hearts. They would remember Clara as the mother who taught them that love could cross any boundary, heal any wound, and build bridges strong enough to span the deepest canyons of human difference. And in the vast silence of the desert night, where ancient spirits watched over all children, regardless of the color of their skin or the language of their prayers, that would be enough.